want to say anything certain but a hot mic.
It's hot.
It's hot now.
It's a hot
Okay,
mic.
okay, it's hot now. Okay.
Welcome back. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Reynaldo Anderson, who is professor at Harris Stowe State University in St. Louis. I first had the opportunity to meet Reynaldo at Astro Blackness 2, which was a conference which took place at Loyola Marymount University 2 years ago. And it was a gathering of Afrofuturists, artists. Nala was there, so Harris was there. And at least for me, it was fantastic. And I think for many people, it was one of the first times people doing diverse work across various disciplines, spectra. I'm sorry, I can't talk much louder because of my ears. We're able to come together and focus around questions of speculative futurism, speculative cultural production, Afrofuturism. So Reynaldo is the co-editor of the book Afrofuturism 2.0. I think Zeal's got a copy if you want to wave it in there. Currently in hardback, but coming in paperback, which if you know academic publishing is a major coup to get this kind of niche work in paperback. So check it out. It's the first compilation of work on Afrofuturism since, well, actually there hasn't really since been one yet, since the social text issue of 2000, since Mark Derry's initial interviews from 1992. So this is hopefully the start of a series of publications. And Reynaldo and I are actually working on a special issue of Topia, the Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies, called Black Lives, Black Politics, Black Futures, which also brings together thinking around Afrofuturism on the political, aesthetic, activism, arts level, bringing that together. So my pleasure to introduce Reynaldo. Thank you.
What you all are going to hear today, you all are getting a preview somewhat of what I'm going to be talking about in Israel in a week. I've been invited to go and talk about this topic, looking at Afrofuturity in relation to Arab futurism, because they did a review of my book with Tohu magazine last year. And I'll be flying all over the place. And then next Saturday, Mark Derry, myself, and Cherie Renee Thomas, who wrote Dark Matters, are all going to have a talk. And I guess you could almost, maybe we could call it the Second Flame Wars or whatever, at the Bronx Museum of the Arts. It's called Bisam Futurismo, where we're looking at Afro-Latinidad in relation to Black futurity as part of the presentation in the Bronx. And part of my background that got me to this point, like I said, I think other than Tobias, I know I'm one of the few people I know with a comm background that's a part of this, because most of the people that do this kind of stuff tend to be from the English departments that are interested in it. They get into it through the literary criticism. My background is in military and entertainment. I served during the Cold War in the Marine Corps on a U.S. flagship in the 7th Fleet. And some of these ideas that I'm going to illuminate that led me to this title was at my university, my students and myself were very much involved with the Ferguson unrest that happened a few years ago. And I remember thinking about some ideas. Then we're getting a bird's eye view when we're protesting. And I remember the guy from MSNBC, what's his name, the real nerdy looking guy, Chris Hayes, and Anderson Cooper being on opposite sides of the street from each other. And we're protesting and the police wouldn't let us be still for more than 10 minutes. And I remember being highly pissed at the time. And then you have all these NGO types. And I remember a guy wearing a Harvard shirt leaning up against the fence watching us like we were lab rats. And that's when I remembered and I came to the conclusion, if the political right suffers this idea of trickle-down economics, the political left has a problem with trickle-down ideology. Because one of the things that happened with the Ferguson unrest was all these young, and the spearhead of it were young, unemployed or underemployed or undereducated young Black youth. And they carried a lot of that stuff on by themselves for almost a month with the assistance of hackers. Because they keep forgetting to leave out the hackers that were involved with screwing with the local communication systems around there that made it hard for the police to bother people. And then a month later, all these outside people start showing up, whether they're NGOs and protest groups. And I remember one of my student leaders on the campus at the time came and asked me, Dr. Anderson, I mean, these people are showing up. What is intersectionality? I said, you know, they were like, I thought we were fighting the police and other stuff. And so, I mean, so the next 6 months turned out to, hi, my name's Jim. I'm an anarchist. Hey, I'm Laura. I'm a Marxist, you know, coming in and out of the city. And so what happened was the people there weren't allowed to develop the solidarity amongst themselves to have a self-sustaining kind of initiative. Like people are surprised when I tell them, you know, Black Lives Matter doesn't even have a chapter in St. Louis. I mean, most of the people that have those signs are in the white neighborhoods, because a lot of the young Black people there feel that outside people, whether from different NGOs, just came in and took their voice from them. And so we started talking about ideology as a privilege. In terms of these people here were treated as though they weren't intelligent enough to figure out their own situation. And so a lot of people turned it into a situation where they could come and use Mike Brown's body and other people to go around the country and fundraise. And I remember in the first 30 days that about 1,000 people were locked up. Darren Seals was one of the activists. He was probably one of the 4 main activists there. He was murdered several months ago. And some of the other people, their lives haven't recovered since then because all the cameras have gone away. And so this, some people, there was some interesting, that movement had so many implications for performance, communication theory, thinking about the future. And that's why and I was in the room when they first started talking about what you all hear about, talking about the Ferguson Commission. It was me, 2 other African Americans, an important local business leader, because we'd had a symposium where the school talked about the need, and it was structured based upon the civil rights commissions of the 1960s. And when I moderated that symposium within a week or so after the killing, I said, if you just change the word Negro to African American in the commission, it looks like we're back in 1968. And that's when the larger business community, translate white, came and said, okay, yeah, we need to have a commission. And the commission turned out to not really do what it was supposed to do. They basically cut and pasted a lot of ideas from the Obama administration and put it in a document. So when you read through the whole document, it doesn't have anything to do with poor Black people getting killed or anything else. It just turns into a potpourri of other stuff. Even though some positive things came out of it, where there were some kind of discussions that came out of it to move forward. And then following up to this is one of the interesting meetings that I will illuminate, because I think Nalo, I think you were here with me at Ferguson is the Future, right? Ferguson is the Future. There was a meeting that collected a lot of the activists, some of the people that are into Afrofuturism, science fiction. Nala was there, I was there, had Alondra Nelson, and a recent scholar whose quote I lifted, he was saying, after Ferguson, multiculturalism no longer governs the socio-political imagination of social justice. Because one of the things there in St. Louis, Ferguson was basically put down by the Democratic Party. It wasn't the Republicans. The mayor of Ferguson's a Democrat. The attorney that was prosecuting the case was a Democrat. The U.S. senator who could have done more was a Democrat. So the Democratic Party did not have a good look coming out of this, and they worked day and night to keep this from metastasizing into a movement that might have been like a Tea Party for the left coming up out of Ferguson. Because a lot of the people some people that were out of town that were in Ferguson later went to Baltimore, because that's where the young man, because you have Baltimore and New York that happened next fairly quickly with Eric Gardner, and then the young man who was Freddie was killed.
Yeah, right.
And by the time it rolls into Baltimore, they kind of figure out how to suppress this thing. And I explained to people, because I'm from Prince George's County, the reason they had to jump on that so quickly, that part of Baltimore is only like 25 minutes from the White House, and they're not prepared to deal with 20,000 angry Black people in front of the White House. So you have the Democrat mayor and all these people work to suppress that from getting out of control. And so I think some of the things similar to what happened to the Occupy movement, I think a lot of these local movements were infiltrated. Forget the police and all that. You have a lot of people who turned it into, I call it nonprofit hustling, and some other issues or grants or whatever to deal with some of these long-standing issues, and they end up supplanting a lot of the local initiatives that people have been fighting with there for a long time. And I remember one of the things that we talked about at Princeton that was put together by Ruha Benjamin, who was the host putting it together. When we came across the country to talk about some of these issues, when they came out, Ferguson is the future. What I can say about Ferguson, I remember that besides dealing with, I remember I was very angry still at the time. Because I mean, some of my students, they've been hit with rubber bullets, gas, and all that. And we turned it into like a humorous thing where I remember my youth leader at the time, because I was the advisor for one of the civil rights groups on campus. She was in my class, and I told her, "Oh no, you all still got homework." So I remember she came from a protest one in the morning, glasses all crooked on her head, from protesting all night. And I told she still had to sit down and take the exam. And because we would ride around, we used the little group me technology to meet up and exchange ideas. And what came out of Ferguson was the beginning of some of the ideas that would later lead to some of the stuff I'm doing now with the Black Speculative Art movement. And at the same time, Astro Blackness is going on, where some of the people that are a mixture of people that are into forecasting, science fiction, critical theory, are exchanging ideas with graphic artists and illustrators. And one of the things that when I talk about and mention about the collapse of the post-racial project that a lot of neoliberals were trying to promote for the last generation, I think it comes to the point when, if you all can remember, a kind of a line of events that go from Beergate with Obama, where I think the police officer represents his friend. And I think because Obama didn't say it right or whatever, he was just totally bashed for it. And I always think of what would have Lyndon B. Johnson said to a beat cop who came to the White House. He probably would have had him thrown out. And so that was the beginning. And then you have after that the Tea Party and birtherism that are happening at that time. Because a lot of neoliberals at the time, the argument was since the 90s, if you play by the rules and you do all this, you can achieve a level of success. And that was proven out to not be true at that time. Also, I remember the NATO alliance when they attacked Libya in 2011, in terms of the Libya action and how some people on the left felt about that. And then at the time, some of you might remember, even some of the feminists were saying it was okay to go and bomb Afghanistan at that time. And so one of the things that about this wave of Afrofuturists thought out here, and when I looked at it, is that you had this tension of multiculturalism, and basically this second wave of Afrofuturism is not a multicultural necessarily event in terms of, but it is anti-oppression, because of people don't draw the distinction between neoliberal progressive and people that are really on the left. A lot of times they collapse those things together, which I think led to why so many people supported Bernie Sanders more than Hillary Clinton. Another aspect of it with this way of contemporary thought promotes the belief that African peoples do not require permission or acceptance from other worldviews to pursue their interests. Because one of the things I remember during the unrest movements, you had so many organizers that would come in and try and impose philosophical positions or whatever that were antithetical to what the local people wanted to do. In terms of treating them as though they were not intelligent enough to organize. And a lot of Black speculative thought, as I have been arguing, it doesn't start with Mark Derry. It goes back to Martin Delany and W.B. Du Bois. When you look at their work, Martin Delany's work, The Hut, which is in the middle of the 19th century, which was written in protest to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in terms of, and this is also during the same time where Darwin is coming out with his work at the time. So that's why I always make the argument in terms of, at least in the Western Hemisphere, it can be argued a lot of Black speculative thoughts at the intersection of anti-slavery, race science, in the 9th century that leads to people like, and there were other people besides Martin Delany. There was a woman, I'm probably missing her name, Frances Hopkins at the end of the 19th century, Sutton Griggs and other people. So this generation, along with Du Bois, produces a lot of the first, or what you might call speculative work, proto-Afrofuturist work that a lot of people draw upon. And these lay a foundation for an Africana futurist paradigm. Now, one of the things that I point out when I wrote the Black Speculative Art Movement Manifesto last year, when I was working on that, some of the things that people that are doing futurity as it relates to aesthetics and art would do well going back and reading some of the works like Plekhanov, Art and Social Life. Because some of the socialists and other activists, they've been debating this since the 19th century, where they had this thing, whether art for art's sake and all these other issues. And I just have a little small sliver of that argument in here. Well, Plekhanov, he comes out with Art and Social Life around 1910 or 11, I think. And really comes out with a concrete in terms of what should an artist do in relation to social activism, progress, and so forth. And then by the 30s, you get Clement Greenberg believing that, talking about avant-garde and kitsch. It seems to be a reaction to what's going on, or the shortcomings of the revolution after Stalin and them take over. And you have the Frankfurt School, and I think Tobias was present last year at Planet Deep South when I made the statement, I can write and define Afrofuturism without citing any of the Frankfurt School. And it comes from this thing about, I think I use this African proverb, I can use my own broom to clean my house. I don't have to use a European broom to get my house together. And then I had to bring out, Adorno's hostility towards certain Black communities. So why would I want to use somebody else's theory when people like Du Bois have been writing theory about Black culture and life for over 100 years to explain it? And then Harold Cruz, if you want to pull up to more contemporary times, Harold Cruz in his book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, talks about in the mid-60s, the politics of art and the related movements. And basically, this crisis was basically an argument between the nationalists and the liberals. Action in the Black community wins out with the passage of the civil rights bills, and this argument had been going on in the Black community in diaspora for well over 100 years. And he talks about this intellectual crisis. And then bell hooks, Marimba Ani, with their work, talk about aesthetics, arts, and activism. Marimba Ani, and related to the last presentation, she has, I believe it's in page 183 of her book, Urugu. Talks about on page 183, talks about how people in other cultures deal with the concept of future time. That as we understand future time is primarily a product of a Judeo-Christian tradition, which then lends itself to where they borrow some ideas from the Greeks and come up with chronopolitics, chronos, in terms of how people deal with time in a very linear way. And that book, I first was exposed to that in grad school, and that's really coming in very useful now in terms of looking at critique of European forms of speculative thought. And then the idea of post-Blackness, which Thelma Golden and other gentlemen put together in the 90s, and basically the argument was that they, to me at least, that after the Black arts movement, I think post-Blackness was just Black art adapting to neoliberal order and globalism at the time, and somewhat apolitical. And so you can kind of say the Black speculative art movement is a response to saying we're moving away from post-Black, that perspective as it relates to art and aesthetics. Now, in advance of the conference, I sat down and thought about, I wanted to have a speculative conference dealing with race, so I decided to define it. I said not to be confused with the debate among contemporary European philosophers surrounding the concept of speculative realism. What I call dark speculative futurity is the 20th century and early 20th century development, emergence, and philosophical perspective of non-white people in regard to their own agency or significance in relation to humanity or other life forms. Furthermore, how they describe or forecast phenomena in terms of their cultural purpose, principles, or goals in regards to global change, technological and social acceleration, ecological process, and interstellar aspirations. Okay. Now, I believe the philosophers call part of this is where teleology. I think we're dealing with purpose. And then, and so that's where I put that term down there as like an umbrella term to describe these concepts of how people in these other cultures are dealing with future time, what's going to happen to them. I know as a conversation with Nalo, other parts of the world, they're really looking at how climate change is going to impact their culture. And they may have been on this island or so for well over thousands of years, and they're going to be displaced. We all know that the elephant in the room, this climate change is going to put a lot of areas of the planet underwater. And it's like the leaders are putting their heads in the sand. And these were some of the debates leading up to this, even to this moment, how a lot of our leaders don't make sense anymore. In terms of, they know, all the smart people know this stuff's about to happening, and you want us to argue over something that, you know, there's not enough urgency from the political leadership regarding these things that are coming up on us pretty quickly over the next generation. So, first of all, before we had to move on to Afrofuturism 2.0, exactly what is it? That's Derry's formulation in the early 90s, which emerges in a neoliberal moment, and he's interviewing Samuel Delaney, Alondra Nelson, Greg Tate, and I'm forgetting somebody. Patricia Rose. At the time, and he coins a phrase. So he didn't really define it. He coins it, describes what he sees happening, and says, for lack of a better word, he gives it a coins this phrase. And this was, I think, an attempt, and he calls it Afrofuturism, which I generally don't have too much of a problem with. You know, in terms of coining, you know, he said, okay, I'm seeing these people do this. This seems to be what it is. But one of the things, if you read Tobias's interview with Paul Miller, that's in his book Ice. Paul Miller says two things, I think, that happened with what I call the first wave of Afrofuturism that I think are true. It didn't really develop a coherent philosophy or a group of people to promote that philosophy in the first 15 years it was out. It was kind of like they coined something, they have a listserv, it was primarily devoted to the digital divide, and that's where I think they kind of left it there. When I think of some of the practitioners at the time, they moved on probably because they couldn't get a job talking about it. And you know, I think Tobias is the holdover from the first wave, and we got to find Tobias something that you know is a valuable, that it turned out to be valuable during the second wave. You know, that baton has been picked up. And so that was some of the problems with Afrofuturism in the first wave. Let me see. I think I'm missing a. Hope I can't go back. All right. I was going to point out other weaknesses of Afrofuturism. Some of them were philosophical in terms of, as I've had discussions with other people. Hope any philosophers are in the room, but I generally criticize post-structuralists a lot. You know, and this comes from, I guess, my American military background. I always say that the French were only good for retreating from the Germans. So I don't like necessarily citing them so much. And, you know, they deal with a lot of nostalgia of Napoleon and the collapse of the French Empire and all this. And I have questions about Foucault in terms of, I believe a philosopher wrote something about him leaving out some critiques that and ideas he got from the Black Panther Party, or maybe didn't identify him correctly or whatever. So. And the French just seem to cause a lot of people misery, and those ideas aren't good to organize anyway. Okay, it leads just to a lot of problems. And I teach my kids how to win. So I said 2.0 that I put in the book. I said it was. I borrowed Kathy Hill's term of technogenesis, reflecting counter histories, hacking and appropriating network software, database logic, cultural analytics, deep remixability, neurosciences, enhancement and augmentation, gender fluidity, post-human possibility, speculative with transdisciplinary applications, and it's become a Pan-African movement now in terms of the way the diaspora, now that they're doing it in Africa. And so some of the things that, whether it's the Afrofutures UK conference that goes on in England now, right now we're in the early stages of, I remember when I first lectured on this in Ghana back in 2014. They were very received. We're working on organizing the West African Conference over in Ghana next summer in Accra. And we're trying to attract in the East Africans and Southern Africans to attend that. And let's see. So yeah, we got the definition, and I guess the fact that it was done in a review and it's in the Science Fiction Journal of Science Fiction Studies now is they argue that should be how it's defined now. I guess that means it must be true. So thank you, Isaiah Lavender, for the review. And so the second thing, neo-nationalism. With Trump, neo-nationalism characterized by high-tech populism and networks rather than nation states. And so like an example of that might be some people might call Black Twitter to a certain extent, characterized by networks, not nation states. So it's not the 19th century nationalism that people think about, dealing with Herder and all this other kind of stuff. And as people have argued, a lot of times nationalism goes back hundreds and hundreds of years before even this philosophical term comes up. And it represents the global revolt against elites. Because part of the is, yeah, there's people sometimes on the left focus on, oh, these right are racist, but really a lot of it focuses on the left's failure to make the state work for other regular people. Because the left kind of makes a truce with capitalism in the second half of the 20th century, promising that, hey, if you all do this, the state will deliver this. And you see it from Europe all the way over here. That's how you get Brexit. That's how you get a Trump. And that's how you get all these other things. It's neoliberalism. And too many people on the left basically made a truce with neoliberalism the last 30, 40 years of the 20th century. You get Fukuyama's The End of History, which turned out to not be true. And then the idea, what they would probably characterize neo-nationalism, they say illiberal democracy, but it's really a reaction to people. The state has not dealt with poverty and other types of freedom for a lot of people within this nation state construct. And so so that's where a lot of the anger is coming to against the failure of the left to really have a serious ongoing critique of the state and its responsibility to poor people or underserved people. And finally, the Dark Enlightenment, a term coined by Nick Land. Phenomenon rises up. Some people argue in the 70s at the CCRU. I can't remember what that acronym stands for. It's out of England.
Cybernetic Culture.
The Cybernetic Culture
Research
Unit out of England, where a small group of them, along with Coalition and others, comes up. That's where Nick Land's out of. I think he's working in China now. Last time I checked, he was teaching over there. And the Dark Enlightenment is characterized by techno-libertarian determinism and reactionism and neo-social Darwinism. And I know a person who's really perfectly kind of fits that that description has probably got Peter Thiel, who's over the CEO who produces, he supported Trump. It was PayPal. He financed PayPal. And that was one of the New York Times talks about Peter Thiel and others that end up putting their money behind Trump, because a lot of the techno-libertarians out of Silicon Valley, they don't care about all this things related to diversity and culture. Now they look at it as getting in the way. And so their aspect of the future indirectly supports this notion of the Dark Enlightenment. Themes of second wave Afrofuturity. And I identify these in the introduction to the volume, dealing with metaphysics, aesthetics, theoretical and applied science, social science, and programmatic space. And this is where I think in this book is the beginning, by having those elements there. We're talking about Afrofuturism as a paradigm. Okay, not just a theory, we're talking about it as a paradigm. Some people might argue between worldview or paradigm, but as a paradigm that has African peoples have their own metaphysics, they have aesthetics, theoretical and applied sciences related to it in terms of what they're producing now. For instance, now you're seeing other applications now in digital humanities. Social science, where you got people like, whether it's Asante's work or Marimba Ani's work that they can be drawn. And then when I say programmatic space, I'm talking about organizations that are actually doing the cultural programming surrounding these ideas, like Rashida Phillips and Kamei Death Star in Philadelphia with their work surrounding Black quantum futurism. What they've been doing in Philadelphia, working with people around housing and other issues. Now, what I'm arguing about with this section here, what I'm calling Black Speculative Art and Design. This came out of a co-curated exhibition that John Jennings and I organized at the Schomburg Cultural Arts Black Cultural Center in Harlem a year and a half ago. And it was following, some of these ideas led to our result of a trip we made to France a few years ago, when I presented some work on critical Afrofuturism and sequential art, and I put it in his book that Francis Gateward and him put together, that was finally published, and he was doing his work with Black Kirby. And it was during this trip that was some of the ideas related to that would become Unveiling Visions, the Alchemy of the Black Imagination. We were talking about what was very important to us coming out of this exhibition was defining terms, in terms of saying what things are rather than having somebody else define them. And so define it, Black speculative art, etc. You can read for yourself. Reimagination of a contested present and act as a catalyst for the future. And a lot of the people, I know Tobias had work in there, an essay, because there's going to be a catalog that's going to be coming out there published. We were dealing with the idea of the ethno-Gothic. We had, I think we had some book covers. I think we had some of Nalo's book covers that were in that artwork. We had Nnedi Okorafor's work. And what was unique about this exhibition, we pulled together about 80 something artists and 20 writers in the space of 90 days to put on an exhibition using technology like SketchUp. So we completely organized a lot of the exhibition in cyberspace because of the technology that's available now. And we could pull upon archives that the Schomburg had at the time. And so the Schomburg's taken all the stuff that was in there and they've made a capsule for it for people that want to study Afrofuturism in the future after we're gone. And it's a part of their archival stuff. Yeah, so coming out of that, we have the exhibition. Shortly after that, we start the Black Speculative Art movement last year. I wrote the manifesto for the Black Speculative Art movement, and it went online, the first excerpt of it, at the invitation, and it was actually Ifeoma Okoye, who's the organizer for Afrofutures UK, asked me to write it, and I was in discussion with John, and so I wrote the preliminary pieces of the manifesto that were published online last January. And since then, I've completed it. It took me, and the complete version will be published in the catalog, and an up-to-date version has been published in Obsidian, the Obsidian journal that just came out that Cherie Renee Thomas edited recently. So I wrote a manifesto for it. And after I went back and looked at what Larry Neal had written, what Du Bois had written, and some other people written around a manifesto for the movement, we put it together. And so whenever you see a Black Speculative Art movement in events, since we've had several of them up to this point, we have these characteristics, people that might deal with Afro-pessimism. I know in the Bay Area, we're dealing a lot with the Afro-surrealists that are up there that are going to be involved. Digital humanities, that's an emerging body of work. Dr. Tanisha Taylor is doing work in digital humanities, which those of you familiar with digital humanities that might be familiar with just going back and looking at archival material. I know the thing that Tanisha likes doing is collecting hashtags around a lot of these events that are going on and make projections based upon that. And I remember when we did a presentation on that in Canada last year at their digital conference was that Edmonton or was that Calgary? I can't remember. It was one of those places. It's in the middle of Canada where it's like Texas up north. Okay. Where they wear cowboy hats and stuff. Calgary, that's right. As I'm saying, they think of themselves like Texans think of themselves up in Calgary. And so this is where we when I was writing this, not as a unified school of thought and how they could kind of collectively get together to do some things, because people get real picky about their niches. All right, now this idea of creative leadership, I remember I got that term from Harold Cruz. He recognized 2 generations ago that with the way the state was going in relation to some other things in art, he said it would take creative intellectuals to kind of deal with some of these issues. So I borrow that term, creative leadership. And there are 3 things I'm saying that they would have to have doing this stuff: foresight to see where things are heading, insight, understand why they are happening, and then oversight, how things are connected to everything else. Because a lot of times people that want to do this kind of stuff, they're focused, they're thinking that some type of science fiction book alone is a roadmap to how to deal with the stuff. And they need to look at some stuff that's like related to science in terms of what does the science say, and then how does the science go with your creative imagination, and then figure out the roadmap. So that's why I'm saying you know something about literary theory and some of these other issues, and understand, and then connect them to some of the issues. Then you might actually have a clear picture of what's happening. There's the 3 forces that are driving everything, and I didn't need Thomas Friedman in his recent book to tell me this. Were globalization, technological acceleration, and then climate change, that are what people engaged in speculative futurity are going to have to deal with. So you're going to have to come up with a speculative philosophy of future time for whatever your interest is, or interest group of people you work with, to figure out what's going to happen. Okay? And it's not because the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or these vacious, so they're not going to necessarily lay things out of you. For example, if I see the concrete information, I'm then informed. If I want to really think about deep thoughts about the future, I might read Samuel Delaney's book, Nova, which kind of implies future fortunes of production in that book. And so then I can look at these material things and then kind of creatively think about, well, how do we get there? Okay, and that's what's missing from what I would call the art of the moment, or some of the other things that out there that people are saying that they're doing and calling it speculative. And it's not speculative, it's retro. Okay, like something that's retro futuristic, make America great again. Okay, very retro. Okay. All right, now, and so to getting things more defined, what are some of these challenges for artivism and futurity? Digitization is really up on us right now when you talk about intelligence amplifiers. I know I was going to to try and get cute, I was going to put a picture from the movie Get Out to be up in there. Like, they're basically putting together the technology to put us in the sunken place and then call it education. Miniaturization in terms of nanotech, quantum computing. I know they're just last year at a Davos meeting, they're talking about where artificial intelligence, or AI, is going to, within the next several years, is going to have a voting place for corporations. They're going to have a vote. Because the AI is not complicated by politics or other things, it's going to be able to have an actual vote. So I guess you can think of what's that computer they talk about on TV now, Watson? Imagine if there's something like Watson sitting at a board meeting with a vote. And then environmental crisis and resource depletion. And so that's why a lot of these things I'm looking at now when I talk to people from the medical field, how they want to, like for instance, even with the college students I have, there's so many of them, I mean, just to want to get through the semester, like are up on Adderall and all these other chemicals to get through the semester. I'm like, you're kind of hurting yourself in the long run. You need to think of some other things to get through this. So the chemicals, medicine, and technology seem to be steering us in a certain direction that people haven't been able to come up. Not a critical mass of people hasn't come up with, emerged enough yet to come up with a coherent philosophical response to this. And so here's some kind of possible strategy solutions. I have bracketed there 2 books that I think, The Shadow Speaker and Who Fears Death by Nnedi Okorafor, who talks about how you deal with post-colonialism that is free from neo-colonialism, and how you're going to have to work through some actual aspects that might be considered violent before you can get to true post-colonialism. And she talks about in the books how one of the female protagonists ends up in a polyandrous relationship. So they're going to have to rethink about how some of the traditional ways of living that the people have to live over in this environment that she's written about. And what I have there in the middle, that's based upon a paper or a study that was done 5 or 6 years ago on forecasting. What those dots represent there. They were trying to argue that from a scientific perspective, there are basically 5 civilizations in the world today, and each of those lines or links to it represent whether there's a strong link to it or a weak link. And the technology exists now to forecast whether you're going to have a massacre or not in a region by analyzing newspapers from the previous 40 years, and then being able to predict what's going to happen the next time there's some type of violent outbreak in a community. And the UN is already using this system, being able to forecast violence and all these other problems in these different areas at the time. So that's where an example of I'm talking about using technology, Afrofuture types, which Lonnie Brooks at Cal State East Bay first presented to me yesterday. Not yesterday, I'm talking last year, which is basically hacking into what Lisa Nakamura and them talk about with cyber types, in terms of being able to forecast what's going to happen. So if you combine Afrofuture types, culturomics, and forecasting, and then creatively think about it in relation to somebody like Nnedi Okorafor's work, then you're kind of getting into where some real hardcore speculative futuristic thought practices and leadership can emerge out of the combination, or as I talked about in the BSAM, how some of these things overlap with each other in terms of allowing us to kind of forecast a lot more clear of what might happen to us if they're not dealt with properly. And that's in a region. Same thing, it can be applied to the Caribbean Basin, Latin America, the Middle East. And speaking of the Middle East, one of the things I'm going to talk about over there when I get to Israel is this distinction between Arab futurism and Gulf futurism. Amir Zuabi wrote a couple years ago talking about this narrative of the underground ghetto city of Gaza, where they're not going to fight about on the land anymore. They're just going to build an underground city like Zion and let them have it. Upstairs, they can have it. We're going to build an underground city that's going to be like Zion, and just leave the land dwellers behind. So it's no longer going to be a fight about land. And so it becomes a critique on this fight over who owns the land by having the citizens of Gaza just burying underground and building an underground city. And then you have the Gulf futurism, which is influenced by Wahhabism or Salafism, urban planning, architecture, and global finance. And they're talking about what happens to the labor of those people over there building all these buildings that are immigrants from other Muslim countries or Asian countries, about their living conditions. And also, I think it reflects the politics of how a lot of times the Gulf states are in alignment with the West in terms of their politics, and that how they also hold up neoliberalism as a way of organizing the world order. And there are a lot of people, they're mad. The Gulf states are angry at the United States right now because of the decision that we made with Iran surrounding some recent developments regarding nuclear technology. And so that's why I'm making the argument that Arab futurism is distinct from Gulf futurism, okay, at least from a preliminary perspective. And I'm going to talk about Latin futurity, because next week we're going to be dealing a lot with this idea of futurismo, because we're having a panel in the Bronx that's going to be dealing with this idea of the way they pronounce it, Afrocentricity, somehow the Dominican citizenry now, because apparently their state had tried to convince them they were not black people anymore. And I believe Juno Diaz criticized them, so they've kind of kicked Juno now out of the Dominican diaspora at the moment. They are now claiming their blackness, okay? And they are looking at, and a lot of this came out of the way the Dominicans were treating the Haitians. And so kind of like the whole black diaspora was mad at the Dominican Republic last year. So, so that's going to be a discussion. And you have a lot of work that's coming out now. Cosmos Latinos is coming out, has been out. And so they're starting to really, in the early stages of really drawing this distinction. And one of the things we're going to talk about is how do Black Latinos see their future in relation to the futurity, in terms of, because so many times it's actually white Latinos that claim to be speaking for the Black Latinos down there. And there's a major Black cultural movement in Southern Latin America right now. Very strong one in Brazil, and in some aspects they're drawing among African traditions more than the North American part of the diaspora is. So that argument is coming. And I saw when I forget her first name, Meryl Watson put this out, this new Mestizo Aesthetics 2.0. So there's like now the Latin Futurismo, the Afrofuturismo, now they're moving into a 2.0 phase. And I didn't have time to add it in there, but now in Germany and Europe, they're doing the same thing. A young lady, Natasha Kelly, she told me, oh, you Black Americans, you're not leaving us behind. They have now established their own Black European network of scholarship now to exchange some of these same ideas. And she's going to be submitting some work, because some of these people that I've mentioned in here are putting work in the second volume or the follow-up on the anthology, which is called the Black Speculative Art Movement, Black Futurity Art Plus Design. That'll be out this fall as a follow-up to the 2.0 volume. Then this idea of Asia futurism. Like one of the things I remember when I was watching The Man in the High Castle, and I wish, and I didn't have time to put the Ghost in the Shell up there. What is this thing with always putting white faces on anime? When I was watching it when I was younger, I knew they were clearly Asian characters. What's that about? And when I landed in the airport, I see Scarlett Johansson all along the wall for Ghost in the Shell. And so, and then when you watch, I don't know if any of you watched this show called The Man in the High Castle, which is fascinating in terms of how it deals with time and Asian characters, based on the work of Philip Dick. And to the left there, the artist's name escapes me at the moment, this idea of China 2185, this idea where in a lot of Asian futurism now, there's some of it at least, and when you say Asian, I mean, they have different interpretations, whether it's Hindu background, Buddhist background, Japan, so there are differences in geography. But as far as the Chinese aspect of it, they're definitely seeing themselves in this coming conflict with the West, in terms of how they talk about some of these concepts that are out here now. And so one of the things I borrow there, are we headed for a clash of futurisms, which is kind of a take on Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations in terms of how these people think about the future. My friend John Jennings and Stacy Robinson are responsible for the art there that's in the panel. John's Black Twitter sign is now I believe now in the new African American Smithsonian Museum. And the piece of art down there to the right is a guy, an Ethiopian American artist that's touring now with this idea. He did a lot of the art and development for Beyonce's recent work she's doing. He's on a world tour with it right now. And so is there going to be a convergence or a divergence around these ideas? And that's, thank you, and I'll stop right there and field questions.
Thank you.
Not to go too far into our lunch, but we do have time for a couple of questions.
Yes.
This is sort of bridging what came up in the last panel too, but do you see places where the idea of all of these different types of futurisms intersecting with what's happening in the post-colonial, decolonial theory?
Well, I'll tell you what, yeah, I can see the possibility of it. For example, if I look at Du Bois' work as a proto-futurist, and I look at his work, say, like Dark Princess, which is where you see this thought of, okay, people of African descent and Asian descent working together against the West. Okay, and I would say this idea of futurity that's emerging, I would say they're worried about it taking on an anti-Western type of perspective. And then, which leads me also to conclude some of the speculative work when I went back and reread Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. I was having breakfast with Tobias this morning, and one of the things I'm going to say when I get over to the Middle East next week, I mean, building walls never saved a civilization. Hadrian's Wall didn't stop the Scots. The Great Wall didn't stop the Mongols. And building a wall in Mexico is not going to stop anything, because first of all, one person who can come as a biological weapon and make 100 million people sick. So a wall is not going to, walls have never kept anything out. It's actually more of a sign of decline and decadence than it is safety or strength. And so, and this is the dark side of the dark speculative material, neo-nationalism. Who's going to win out, the demagogues or the prophets? The demagogues might take a rightward twist with this and say, okay, we're going to use these other groups that we can get our hands on in terms of difference to do something to them. Or they might take a left, more of a left kind of perspective and say, okay, this is what's all, and we organize around that. And so that's why there can be some speculative overlap around some things, but that's where you. I was driving here, I was thinking it's going to be a clash between the prophets and the demagogues in terms of forecasting what may or might not happen. And I hope our prophet, one of our resident prophets, will have something to we'll have something to say about it this afternoon. You know, and when I tell people, I'm like, hey, don't kill the messenger. You know, because I know Peter Kalu, when I talked in England, he said, oh, you are the last messenger. And I said, no, don't put that on me. I'm just making some observations, like the GPS, the foresight stuff, and just pulling the threads together and drawing some logical conclusions and to make the case. And it's open for revision. So, yeah.
I'm curious about your thoughts on the use of Black versus African, Afro, or African Black, and how one encompasses the entire global group and another, just maybe more specific.
Well, like I explained earlier, social change is messy. And after I spent a summer as a visiting lecturer in Ghana. I think those kind of distinctions are breaking down. I mean, everywhere I went in West Africa, I mean, even up in Sweden, I was getting off the plane and they're listening to trap music, you know. And so the point is they haven't had a chance to market their stuff over here. It's normally a one-way thing, you know, in terms of the creative impulse. Now, Black Americans, African Americans have just had an advantage based upon our relationship to empire, to getting our stuff out. When I was in the military, I remember we went to Australia. In Australia, they called it, because all of the Black military personnel had the latest mixtapes or whatever back in the 80s. They didn't have MTV. And everywhere we went, I'm seeing like all these Asian people doing Michael Jackson moves and all this other stuff. And a lot of times they used to ask Black sailors and Marines to bring the music to the nightclub. And so, and that wasn't because we had the best stuff. It's because we were with the empire. You know, in terms of the advantage of empire has given us an advantage of putting our ideas and thoughts out there. And it's in one of the debates when I talked about Afrofuturism, I said at Astro Blackness a couple years ago, I said that the Africans would do more than Afrofuturism than the African Americans would. Because also in Afrofuturism, you could speculate and you have the applications of military science. I said most African Americans, if they do it, they'll probably do it for some type of aesthetic performance, or to get tenure or something like that and do something cute. Whereas somebody that controls their own educational system, their own military academy and all this, because we know here in this country that they use science fiction authors that work with think tanks to come up with how to resist terrorism. So I perceive some of these African countries, they'll do the same thing eventually, where they get with some creative people, their own version of AI and some other things, and come up with their responses. So I think the future of Afrofuturism would be in Africa. And people that, well, what do you mean? I said, Pan-Africanism, the idea started in the diaspora, but it becomes actualized in Africa with the formation of the African Union. Okay, so that's why I would say it functions, the diaspora is like an ecosystem, rather than these just things that are separate from each other. It's much more of an ecosystem, and so that's kind of how I treat it, you know, and that's kind of like why in the Bronx next week we're dealing with Afro-Latina Dad in terms of them giving voice to how they relate to this speculative, creative matrix in terms of how they define themselves into it. So it's just a part, I look at it more as an ecosystem than a bunch of separate categories. Well, I didn't depress anybody. Hopefully.
I'm trying to get you one-on-one.
Oh, okay, all right, okay. Well, one thing I want to thank you all for inviting me. This is actually the first time I've talked at a comm department in my own field. Most of the time I get invitations from the cultural studies people or the, so I guess we're making history. This is the first comm department that has had something like this. So you all have yet. And put that notch on your belt at your report to the dean, you know, that you got to do at the end of the year. So. And hopefully I can take some stuff back to you. I've just gotten to go ahead. They're going to let us start a comm program at my school, so I have to chair that into existence. And so that's going to be pretty fun. And but nobody told me what a headache it was to be a chair. So, but it's been nice talking to you all today.
Thanks, Ron. We're breaking for lunch. We'll be back here at 1:30 for 2 afternoon sessions before we then proceed to the Armor Theater for even more.
Yeah, thank you all. I just wanted to say before we adjourn for lunch that I personally wanted to take a moment to thank our department manager, Yolanda Avila, who is the foundation that keeps all of this together. This conference and putting everything together would not have been possible without her. She has made magic happen with very little and in a short amount of time. So if you see her walking around, coordinating things, powerful woman, exudes that energy, short silver hair. Give her a hug. She totally deserves it. So thank you. Lunch is outside in the breezeway, and we'll adjourn to the first floor through the glass doors on the end of the building. That's the Armor Theater. We'll meet there after lunch.
No, we're not going after the lunch.
Oh, I'm
We have
sorry.
2 more
Yes,
sessions here.
2 more sessions here.
Yeah.
Ignore me. Yes, we'll meet back here, and I will check the schedule. And see what's going
Wow, that was good. Actually, out of the I can now like open class.
No, I just started right now.
Oh,
While you're back. Yes.
Yes.